Welcome to Native Calgarian and Mossy for listening. I'm your host, Michelle Robinson, speaking to you in Mohkinstsis in the Blackfoot Confederacy, home of the Nitsitapi, Sutina Dene, and the Yiharhi Nakota. I talk about history, current news, unheard news, book clubs, with special guests to give local or national issues a voice through an urban Satu Dene lens. My life's work will be to honor the voices of my ancestors and next generation with humor, love, and truth. Reconciliation is work, not performance. May we honor all Indigenous voices with that courage. Today is July 5th, 2025. Welcome to Native Calgarian. If you enjoy hearing Indigenous content by the Satu Dene woman, my Patreon account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for showing your support. For those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, where you can send in your comments or questions. Giving a review helps whatever medium you're listening from. I have a YouTube channel where you can go and subscribe. I'm on all the streaming services. Go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media if you don't know what streaming services are or where to find them. And also, remember to share the things you learned to your network. Oki, naganago, mekoche, chestokom aki. Nera, dago, dekots, nagotine, siku, seredi. My name is Red Thunder Woman. My married English name is Michelle Robinson, and I use they, them pronouns. My Dene lineage roots me in the land of the Great Bear Lake tribe in Treaty 11 in Delaney. I'm a native to Turtle Island, and my Dene nation is uninvited to this area of Clinchotine Indahe in Satu Dene, meaning many big dog town, named after the Calgary Stampede, which is flying right now. I was born in Calgary, or in Blackfoot, Mohkinstsis as Michelle Elliott, an English name that has afforded me privilege in an English colonial world. Acknowledging proximity to whiteness is important because the darker the skin, the more racism a person experiences in colonial spaces, and your proximity to whiteness determines your safety. My late great-grandmother or grandfather, is Milo Bewell from Delaney. His daughter Alice is my now late granny. My mother and I are Northern Slavey Dene, or Satu Dene. But my Indian Act and Post status card by the Canadian government says Yellowknives Dene First Nation. Through my father, I am a daughter of the Mayflower and a daughter of the American Revolution. Having a Canadian Indian Act and Post status card is a colonial construct by Canadian policies meant to divide Indigenous peoples' inherent rights. Indigenous Two-Spirit, or the Indigenous 2S community, and Indigenous women are at the bottom of the Canadian socio-economic ladder because of purposeful Canadian policy. Colonial trauma, imposed poverty, racism, gendered violence, and land theft. I'm not a social worker nor an elder, nor do I speak on behalf of all Indigenous people, but I can share my journey as a Dene mom navigating this racist, ableist, colonial, misogynistic world in 2025. I think of this today, and I think about the many Indigenous lives lost for the so-called country named Canada. I hope you see your role in the importance of stopping harm and as a citizen, see your role in reconciliation, and as a treaty partner, I hope to empower you enough to do that. Land Back is a movement that could save the planet from climate change created by colonialism, but it would be part of treaty partnership, meaningful reconciliation, honoring global initiatives like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and having settlers unpack their racism. As a former geomatics drafter, be happy to teach you more about that too, but you'd have to go to nativecalgarian.com for more. So this is actually my second attempt at doing this podcast today. It's not a waste. I basically did the whole thing while being on TikTok live, but then didn't hit record on my actual recording software. So this is actually the second time I'm doing it. But another gift I got from that mistake was that I got to talk to a Muslim friend here that I had met in Calgary a while ago. I don't remember actually meeting them, but they are Indigenous, and they're now a Muslim. They've converted to being Muslim. And it was interesting because I think sometimes I think, well, you're all, listening to all of my podcasts, so you have perspective. But I'm realizing, and especially because of some of my TikTok content, a lot of you are new to my podcast and to meeting me. So I don't have my bio in front of me, so I'll just kind of wing it here. But basically, I have been when I had my daughter and was thinking about having kids, I was very concerned as an Indigenous woman having a child when all I had ever seen was negative content by Settler Canada on Indigenous people. And I started to get more and more political as I had my child. When I had my child, I experienced extreme medical racism. I worked with the late Manmeet Bhullar to get midwifery funded in Alberta because at that time it wasn't. May 5th, while it is Red Dress Day, it's also the International Day for the Midwife. And in 2008, it's even in the Hansard records that Manmeet Bhullar spoke and talked about my issues that I had. I tried to work with, at the time, Calgary Health Region about doctors because I was naive enough to think that if you work the process, it'll work for you. Dumb Michelle of that time, let me tell you. Anyway, got midwifery funded. So you can understand my anxiousness about what's happening in Alberta right now, where they have cut health services into like four branches that are all being privatized and make zero sense. But also on top of that, I felt very confident and strong in at that time in about 2019 to run provincially. So I am a massive fan of Kevin Taff. He was the original Liberal leader against Ralph Klein, and he published quite a few books, and he's still a prof up in Edmonton. He might be retired now. But anyway, I really used a lot of his light as a guiding light. At that time, David Kahn was the Liberal leader, so he was open. And at that time, it seemed like Canadians were more willing to have conversations about reconciliation and racism. So I felt very comfortable running at that time. Lots of political activism in between that, and including being a part of the Liberal Party since 2011. I had a meeting yesterday. We had a conversation about the campaign and some of the things that had happened that I can't really say publicly nor on the podcast. But, at the end of the day, I think political advocacy is being in those circles, but also beyond that, you got to protest, you got to be out in community. And one day my husband said to me, Michelle, you have to start a podcast. And I said, that's the most pretentious thing I've ever heard in my life. And he said, look, the cattlemen, the farmers, they all have podcasts. The CN Rail folks, they all have podcasts. And so he threw a mic in front of me and he said, start talking. So I have talked about the world through my eyes as I have seen. And the conversation I was having with my Muslim Indigenous friend was that she was feeling very attacked about her faith, which it valid within itself. But like I said to them, if you've listened to my podcast in the past, which I know a lot of you, I understandably can't go through years of my podcast. So I'll just say that, long time ago, before when it was Trump and Dick Cheney and dark times of like Iraq War and 9/11, we weren't as Indigenous people allowed to speak in the mainstream at all. There were very small circles of activists that we were on Facebook at that time. That's all we had. And, you know, we, I was heavily involved in the 9/11 truth movement because, I had a background as a drafter. I, respectfully understand a little more about engineering than I think most people. For those who don't know, Calgary has the highest number of engineers than anywhere else in the world. And yeah, I just thought this was really too fishy. And the more I read, the more fishy I knew it was. And, if you start to learn about false flags in the past, you see the pattern. So I now, as of today, know I have ADHD. I likely have autism. And I was seeing those patterns, right? So I spoke out about that stuff then. And one of the patterns that I seen on Twitter and Facebook was that very clearly the military industrial complex were on these social medias. They were starting to infiltrate our 9/11 truth movement. and it became very misogynistic. And that was when about the time I left. Shortly after that, they started to have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and we started to openly talk about Indigenous issues. So I felt a safer place there, and that's where I met John Boncour, Splitting the Sky. Um, and I got to hear about real activism, really. I got to learn about real activism. We had Occupy here in Calgary. I had ran shortly, I want to say 2017 municipally, 2019 provincially, and I've been a part of the Liberal Party federally since 2011. I was really proud of the provincial policies that we had created for the platform. And I thought we were going to be far more successful, and we weren't. And the Orange Crush happened. So, just to give you an idea of how astute I might be, I didn't see that coming in any capacity, and I still believe that David Kahn would have been one of the best voices to have in the legislature in Alberta. So that's a little bit about who I am, where I come from. For settlers or for new Indigenous or for anybody who's listening kind of to this tail end of my podcast. That's who I am. That's where I come from. I'm very proud to work on policies within the Liberal Party of Canada, but unfortunately, they usually don't get implemented. I do have success stories. Those are for another day. I really want to get into my podcast today, and I want to say that to that Muslim follower of mine, thank you. We apparently had met for coffee. I feel really bad for not remembering between COVID and between now being perimenopausal and having ADHD and understanding what burnout is. I feel really bad that I can't remember people's names and such, but I will say, and I was trying to explain to them that from seeing all these patterns that I have seen from Facebook and Twitter, my Facebook and Twitter, I have tens of thousands of people blocked, and they have a pattern to them. They troll, they bot, they have the same talking points, they have really the same images. Sometimes they're like lions with the Israel flag. Sometimes they're like these Christian, Roman like symbols and old school English stuff. Like you can tell who they are. And of course, they're like lockstep and key with policing and basically imperialism, violence against Indigenous people, whether here or nationally. And this person was saying to me, well, I only hear you talk about MMIW stuff, or at least their algorithms are set so that's all they see of mine, and that's fine. But that's like one component of the bigger picture of imperialism and colonialism and how it's affecting Indigenous people. Like sooner you kill all the Indigenous women and girls, and that's why we experience the most medical racism and death. Like that's how you feel good about stolen land, basically. So whether it's here or globally, we have the Calgary Stampede happening. So this is the time where all of the dark politicians meet and they do all of their dirty politics and dark money and dark forces. And for those who know, Stephen Harper doing lots of like trust fund stuff for Israel or the military industrial complex in general. And so, I've been very much anti-Israel and anti-Zionist for decades. I have a lot of that under my belt for a long time. So watching this genocide of Palestinians right now is it's breaking my heart. And it also breaks my heart because the very like advocates for Palestine here, they haven't had the luxury of seeing the patterns that I have seen. They haven't had the luxury of doing this political activism online from a safe place in Alberta, in Canada, for the last, I don't know how long I've been on the internet, but it's been a while, a few decades now. So, um, but I should tell you something funny. My daughter, this little smartass, comes out to me and they go, so 9/11, hey, like I wasn't even born for that. And I'm like, yeah, I know. So dad was telling me about when before there was 911. And I'm like, yeah. And she goes, you realize that you're older than both 9/11s. And I'm like, fucking piece of, I just like Homer around Bart, but no, in my head. And She said it, they said it so confidently. Like I was never going to kick him out of the house or anything. So, anyway, that's how old I'm old, old, old. And so I've seen some patterns in politics. And so if you aren't anti-establishment, anti-military industrial complex, and have been doing it for decades, you probably wouldn't see the patterns. And as it turns out, if you don't have autism and ADHD, you don't either. So needless to say, if you are an oppressed group of people, there is a high chance the bots that are coming after you are perpetuating the military industrial complex. So the more hate they can spread, the more at risk you are, but also the more at risk the world is, right? It's trying to destabilize democracy. I keep saying Israel, and it is Israel. It's also Russia. It's also India. You know, these are real threats to our stability here. Yeah, I hate to use the word democracy because that is a Western colonial Westminster system that's been imposed on our people. So it's not a real democracy by any stretch. So that's why, yes, I'm a Liberal Party member. I was for a while provincially. I'm no longer. I'm just a federal one. And honestly, I do that because I feel like being at the table is important. And I'll give you an example. I was at a convention and the Saskatchewan um, like division, we call it PTA of Saskatchewan, they said we want to force everyone to vote. So we have an opportunity at convention to have like nays and yays and that. So I went to the mic and I introduced myself as Satu Dene and Indigenous and part of the Indigenous Peoples Commission, and I talked about why that was a bad idea. And I talked about the barriers that Indigenous always face for voting and how we already have an overrepresentation of Indigenous people in jail. So that would be a really poor idea for us to do now. And I did this provincially because Dr. David Swan felt the same way. And I said, well, that would be bad because of this. So he actually was started talking about tax incentives. So like if you vote, you get $50 off of your taxes or something, right? Like so that was kind of how we were trying to promote voting in order to do that. But I mean, I've door knocked this area a billion times, and I know a lot of people who come from legitimate places where they force you to be political, and they never wanted to vote ever because they never want to be political, because that's why they came to Canada so that they would have the choice not to be political. And as immigrants, I'm never going to say, well, that's a privileged take, because while it is a privileged take, they understand the oppression from where they came from. So, as Indigenous people, the treaties say to share the land. So, like, as an Indigenous person trying to talk about immigration, I talk about how if you can respect the treaty and you see yourself as a treaty partner, let's make this work. That's why I would never turn away a refugee. And there's some really great folks out there who do great content on no borders and why borders are stupid. And I think that that's the right take. So that's a little bit about me and where I come from and why it is I have a podcast. So for those who are newer, thank you for listening. Thanks for joining me on this journey. Um, it was really hard to start the podcast because I talk about sex work, I talk about 2S LGBTQ issues, I talk about violence, I talk about the military industrial complex. So I was actually rated 18 plus and unable to be public for, I don't know, 6 months, the first 6 months, which is that window of whether or not you get amplified in the world. And, knowing Indigenous people, that women are suppressed in the algorithms anyway, I just knew it wouldn't be that popular. But for the 5 people who followed me, just kidding, I had lots of followers on the social medias, they would have a place to hear more from me because that was the feedback I also got from a lot of folks in my political circles, is that I could listen to you all day. So I started a weekly podcast and I talk about the things that I see as we go. And I have lots of Indigenous guests or guests that I think are affecting everyone in our treaty partnerships. So, like our last podcast, which I can't thinking about, was with a settler, Julian Branch, and he is a journalist that has spoken extensively about asbestos in the pipes and done tons of research. So, if you've seen that W5 special, he's the one who was one of the main guests in there talking about the asbestos in the water and in the pipes. And I think it's a crying shame that we're talking about infrastructure nationally and we're not talking about asbestos because there should be zero pipes with asbestos. And globally, the countries that have figured out that Canada sent us asbestos pipes and they're pieces of terrible crap, they're stuck with like, okay, how do we clean this up now? Because asbestos is terrible. So it's actually a global issue. We have a black eye globally over this issue, and settlers are like, "Oh my God, someone was mean to me on the internet." So with the deepest respect, I talk about bigger pictures. I talk about systemic issues, and not necessarily somebody was mean to me on the internet, unless I can talk about some craptastic takes somebody gave me. I can talk about the systemic racism that's embedded in that, or the systemic issues that are embedded in that. So that's the way I talk and I think. I also have a book club. So some of my podcasts are book clubs that we've just put onto the podcast so that you can hear about the book that we read and went through in the hopes that maybe it'll inspire you. Sometimes the authors even come to the book club. So a lot of times we'll have a book club with this amazing author. And a few settlers from that, like I have like at least two that have been there for years. And so they were like, we got to do more. So that's why we founded the Reconciliation Action Group. So if you see me sharing the Reconciliation Action Group, please go like them and share their stuff because, this is Indigenous led and it's not registered charity. It's not recognized in colonial settings because the biggest problem that I find, this is why I ask for donations too, is that in colonial settings, like so your business or your nonprofit, maybe your government, you'll hire a native or two, and those people you don't recognize the oppression dynamics. So of course they're going to put the spirit of the buffalo into you, maybe even give you a native name, and you're going to feel really good and say, this is my native friend, and they don't talk like you because you don't recognize the oppression dynamics. If they told you what, every time you touch their hair or compliment them, the microaggressions they're actually having from you, like you're just point blank being racist and you don't even know it, and they need a job. They need to put food on the table and they need to be housed, right? So a lot of us just put up with your racism. And that's the key to the podcast is that I can be like, hey, that's racist. And people will be like, as uncomfortable as I am to hear that, I explain why. And the hope is you learn. And the hope is, even if it's something little or something big, you share that into the world so that it's not a big, nuanced take, because it shouldn't be. And natives who you claim to care for should be able to say that's racist to you and you be willing to listen. I know in North America that's not the case today. In North America right now, we have a whole new Nazi regime called ICE, and we fund it. As Canadians, we're funding Israel to be murderous war crimes against Gazans. That's the reality. So, respectfully, I understand why some of you are too afraid to talk about this. As an Indigenous woman, my life is at risk no matter how Apple I act, no matter how much I white code, no matter how kind I am. If I go missing today, the same resources will not be put into me as they will be put into a non-Indigenous person. And we are underserved and over-policed, whether we're talking about actual justice system, healthcare, education, you name it. That's the way it is. So This podcast is honest and raw. And if you are not ready to be called racist, this isn't the place for you. If you try to follow me on on my social medias, you're welcome to. But if you find yourself blocked, it's because your take was bull. So I can't block people from listening to my podcast. So you are more than welcome to listen to my podcast. And in the meantime, I'm going to continue as if I didn't had to redo it because I didn't hit record the first time. But again, grateful that some of my TikTok followers wanted to chat with me afterwards, and hopefully you feel if you've listened to this that there was some nugget from each podcast worth sharing. And, I give you some nice light bulb stuff too, so you can share that. Like Jillian Branch is settler, so you don't have to feel so sad panties that I shared, just the racist stuff. Anyway, I can't quit thinking about that podcast. I also had Courtney Gucci on. She graduated with my daughter, and while my daughter was valedictorian, Courtney won a scholarship, and I'm just like Indigenous joy. That's the other thing this mainstream media refuses to show. So my hope is that somebody else will steal my content because that was what was happening at the start of my podcast is that all the media would steal my content and do stories based off of what I put out there, which I don't care because that's why I do the whole podcast. I want people to know about Courtney and winning a scholarship and Jillian and the work he's been doing with asbestos. So that's why I do this because I truly believe in making the world a better place. And as much as it might hurt some people to hear me talk about racism, I'm literally doing this for the next generation. And I want you all to be on this ride. This is what reconciliation actually is changing hearts and minds and hopefully changing this world for a better place for the kiddos. So, I also, in our book club, we had read Winnipeg by Dr. Nagan Sinclair. Like, I love him to pieces. I will go on and on about why he is amazing. Anyway, that's two podcasts ago or three that I went on why I love Dr. Sinclair. Um, he wrote in there on page 129. Uh, June 24th, 1972 was the anniversary of one of the worst aviation disasters in Manitoba's history. There were residential school students that were being transported from one area to another, and it went down. And I just thought, until I had read it in his book, and as he said, his dad talked about how aviation was a tool of colonization and a tool of residential school. That is true. But that bigger picture that, like, we can honor this loss and do it yearly, and we should be doing it, and yet we're not doing it because the truth is, settlers were like, oh my God, I love natives and I want reconciliation, but they haven't read the books and they don't read the new books. So they're not doing the work to have meaningful reconciliation. So I want to honor those folks, and I want to say thank you to Dr. Nagan Sinclair for, going out of his way to document this, but also the Reconciliation Action Group for being willing to be like, okay, this is an annual anniversary we are going to recognize forever, and I hope that all across the nation we do. So the victims of this horrific crash were Margaret Robinson, Mary Rita Canada, Ethel Greaves, Rosalie Balfour, Wilkie Muskego, Iona Winnisk, Roy Sinclair, Deborah Sinclair, and the pilot was Scott Coughlin. And so I honor them, and I'm grateful that the Reconciliation Action Group, put out the graphics and are doing that work. Because to me, that's actual reconciliation, is when we start acknowledging the gravity of what it took. And that's why at the very start of my podcast, when I say I want to honor all the Indigenous lives lost for this so-called country named Canada, these are the names as well. We have thousands more to add to that, but at least here's some that matter that need to be recognized. So speaking of anniversaries, so one of my favorite people is Jeremy Clausen, Clauses, and he has done like a local journalist. Well, he does a newspaper called The Sprawl. And then he pivoted and he also added the Sprawl Cast, which is a podcast. So it's one of my favorites because it's Calgary based, right? And he's a journalist, so he does the proper research for certain things. So their latest one that they put out was Calgary at 150, the Forgotten Anniversary. Very important anniversary because the whole reason why the Northwest Mounted Police were even established were to get rid of me so that I couldn't even be here talking to you today. To all the Blackfoot that are in, well, all of Treaty 7, because it's not just Blackfoot that are at the Elbow River right now. These motherfuckers were literally created to eliminate us so that we couldn't be at the Calgary Stampede today. So Fort Calgary was established in 1875. That's 150 years ago. This is the forgotten anniversary. Here we are. Let's have reconciliation. But we have the 231 calls to justice. We have a whole justice component of the calls to action for the TRC. And we're not even acknowledging that, the Northwest Mounted Police started settler colonialism for Calgary 150 years ago. Yeah, that's Calgary. Welcome to my world. There's another, a sad way to talk about this too is like what has changed in 150 years. And I'll tell you nothing, because in the news, and I shared it on my socials, there was this young Indigenous man that got the crap beaten right out of out of him by Constable David Willem of the Calgary Police. He assaulted him while he was intoxicated. Um, and Justice Mark Mastel and Defense Counsel Corey Wilson, they taught us now that there's no such thing as Indigenous people for justice. Because while settlers today are going to be drunk as a skunk and the Calgary Stampede is going to smell disgusting with their puke and beer, if you're native and drunk in public, that's an excuse for Constable Willem and other police officers to beat the crap out of you, which they did. So, and Justice Mark Mastel and Defense Counsel, they just taught us, you know, settlers can get drunk and are not going to get assaulted by police, but we do, and we die. We disproportionately die in police custody. So we will always be underserved and over policed. And we have now 150 years to mark the occasion to do that. So now flipping that, Indigenous joy. I'm going to talk about that because, you know, it's as hard as Canada tried to eliminate us, we're still here. As racist and terrible as they are in the education system, you know, we're getting there. We're starting to get more Indigenous people graduating in these colonial education school systems. And so my daughter graduated and ended up being valedictorian, which I'm really honored that that happened. Um, there was two grads. There was a grad just for Indigenous people for there. My child was through the Calgary Board of Education, the CBE. So CBE had their own grad ceremony for all the grads all across Calgary. There was something like over 300 of them. Only like 170 could go to the actual ceremony, which we went to. There weren't allowed. In my graduation, I had like all my aunts and uncles. I had anyone who was willing to come to my graduation, and with them though, it's like only a couple of people can come. So my daughter, my husband and I went to my daughter's Indigenous grad, and we got to see the Native kids. They got like a blanket and were treated well. The Métis got a sash, and the Inuit had a very specific northern gift that was given to them. And so, really proud moment because in my generation, I graduated high school in '94, and that was in a settler colonial education system, not residential school, which we're still running at that time. Um, and we would never wear a ribbon skirt or beaded anything. We would try to literally hide our identity at that time, if you could. So, like, because I didn't look Cree or Blackfoot, because I'm not, um, a lot of people, they knew I wasn't white, but they didn't know what I was. So, and I grew up in Sylvan Lake, very racist time then, I would argue still today. And you didn't have Indigenous pride at all. There was nothing kind or positive being said. I would argue in 2025, there's not either. It's still microaggressions, what is printed. Regardless, to see today in 2025, so 150 years after Fort Calgary was established, all of these kids, be honored not just for graduating high school, but with a recognition of the incredible barriers that it took for them to graduate a high school that non-Indigenous kids never face, right? So I was proud of each and every one of them, whether they were there or not. I am so proud of you. I can't even. So then the second grad was like just the school grad that was at the school. And settlers and indigenous kids. And my daughter would jokingly say the cowboys and the Indians, just by the way, because like we're in Forest Lawn community, the greater Forest Lawn area, and a lot of people look down on this area because this is the working class. Like, right, these are regular people, and the rest of Calgary is so affluent that they look down on people in Forest Lawn, which is disgusting, ridiculous, and why part of the reason why I ran, because I'm like, whatever, we're the best people ever. We have the best food. Don't bring your yuppie crap over here and ruin this place. We have like what actual multiculturalism is, as opposed to whatever whitewashed version you have at Chinook Center. Um, you know, so that's what I think of the rest of it. I'm just kidding. Anyway, so you have all of these kids, and the school my child went to is a trade school. So they're registered to go to SAIT as an electrician, and they were showing off all of their great projects there and that. And on the agenda, because my daughter was valedictorian, I was reading it, and it said, "Oh, Canada." Ugh. So the friends and there's an organization here in Calgary called USA, and a lot of folks were there because they're at Jack James all the time, or at the school that my daughter goes to all the time. And that they're all there, and I said to them, look, I talked to my daughter yesterday. I have raised them, and I shouldn't even say it was me. For folks who listen to my podcast, I had the wonderful Dr. Pam Palmater on my podcast. I was honored to be on hers. And even before we were both podcasting, she had come to Calgary, and my daughter, at a very young age, got to hear firsthand from this woman how you never stand for "Oh Canada" as an Indigenous person. And Pam obviously has a really great way of telling it. 'Cause from that moment on, my daughter has never stood for "Oh Canada." So, so I explained the best I could to the guests that were there for Sam, to say, look, we had a conversation. I know as valedictorian, it's going to be very hard for her to do, but likely is going to sit through "Oh Canada." I'm going to sit in solidarity. Although when you're in a black, like, no lights crowd, me sitting is not going to be like a big deal of solidarity, right? But the teachers right in front of us, I think, heard all of this, and just there was no "Oh Canada" being said. So that was a whole thing of anxiety I didn't even have to worry about. Thank God. It's in the agenda though. So like it's not like it wasn't that we didn't recognize "Oh Canada." One of my friends that is in our area, their daughter did the land acknowledgement. I was really proud of them too. Really proud to see my child in the cloak and the beaded cap, and did their speech that they wrote the day before. Like, so anyway, a lot of Indigenous joy and pride from that. Congratulations to any Indigenous kid for the class of 2025. I am so proud of you for being who you are, and acknowledge all the barriers it took for you to get there. For all the new settlers, our treaty partners who graduated from 2025, I honor you too. I know a lot of the newer Canadians, refugees, like, this was not easy for you to be here. So I acknowledge that that was hard for you as well. And because all of the grads obviously went through COVID. We're dealing with ADHD, autism diagnosis, understanding what that is now. We never had that opportunity to explore before COVID. So, I know it's not easy. And I know you kids, holy cow, you guys, you kill me on the inside. The Santee, you kill me every time you say, that's my 13th reason. I know what you're talking about, and you are all have a reason to be here. When you feel sad, please remember there are resources for you. If you're Indigenous, there are Indigenous resources for you. If you're non-Indigenous, 988, call it, call the kids' help phone. I did when I was a kid. When I was a teenager, I called the kids' help phone. So there's no, crime in that. Locally, the 211, it all goes together. So I never want you to feel like you're alone. And I also want you to reach out if you ever do feel alone, because this crazy, like, imperial war, colonial capitalist crapola system where it feels like you're never going to get anywhere, that's not true. That's just not true. I don't know why all of your parents and grandparents allowed this craptastic system to be going the way it is. It didn't used to be so bad. The grandparents, the boomers had opportunities because of policies that were in place at the time. I could go on and on about why it's shit now, but there are some amazing content creators out there already doing that, podcast journalists that are doing that work. And so I implore you to learn more about that when you're feeling sad. Even as a native, when I get hit with racism, first thing I do is pick up a book. My two go-to are Nice Racism and White Fragility from Robin DiAngelo, because it helps give me the words to explain why it is this sucks so bad. So if you are a non-Indigenous kid and you're like, man, I'll never buy a house, like, go read Dr. Kevin Taft. Go read some of the books that are out there explaining why it is that the economics today are set up in the way so that it feels like everybody's failing. I mean, that's capitalism, that's imperialism in general. Um, and they never taught me that in school, just like you're not being taught anything that I think you should be taught in school of importance. But, that said, you are being taught foundational things. The hope is when you graduate high school, you continue your journey, whether that's through trades, whether that's through universities, whether that's through the library. Learn, learn, learn. Never quit learning. I learn every day, and I want that for you. I did not mean to go on such a rant for the class of 2025, but I know some of you do listen to me, and I'm honored you do. And I want to honor you and your journey too. So, all right. So, for folks who listen to my podcast, I'm going to reference 20 or 20, November 20th, 2023. That podcast, I had Sandra LaRock McLeod on. They are Indigenous, they're Métis. They run the Rainy Creek Land Ranch in Bentley area. And, this is someone that I should have known in Sylvan Lake that I never knew, but whatever. We're meeting today. Anyway, they have been trying to raise awareness about the Medicine Hills or the Bentley Ski Hill. Uh, Up there are Indigenous graves. And Bentley, the town of Bentley, is still going to go ahead with a bunch of development, even though there are Indigenous graves there. So, go listen to that podcast, but also follow Sandra LaRock McLeod. So, you're a settler listening to me. I've given you a few things you can share from this podcast already. Sprawlcast, the podcast. You can share the article I was telling you about where you can beat up Indigenous people if they're drunk. I actually have been talking about Sam's Grad in the last person I had on there, Reconciliation Action Group, honoring some of the people who died in that terrible crash for the residential schools. Now I'm giving you another one, a podcast that you can share about the Bentley Ski Hill or the Medicine Hills, and go follow them and see the updates about what is happening as it goes. I'm going to have to just ask them, come back on here and talk. So it's important that you know, because you can't claim you didn't know if you heard this. Anyway, let's go into a little more Alberta. So it turns out we're going to have to start paying for the COVID-19 vaccine because Danielle Smith is all about privatization. Now, I talk a lot about treaty right to health. If you Google that as Canadians, you will see that we are supposed to have health care. And it's not supposed to be something we pay out of pocket for. So that's why during COVID, we had a lot of the Indigenous health networks work with the government, and Indigenous people were allowed to get whatever they needed for COVID-19 vaccines because we are disproportionately impacted by health issues thanks to all the craptastic health policies and experiments that Canada has done on Indigenous people. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back to some of my podcasts where I talk about medical racism and I talk about the experiments being done. And you're outing yourself for not reading the TRC because a lot of them are in there too. So, start following Indigenous content creators, start listening to APTN, follow Windspeaker, follow, like here locally, if you're in Calgary, you better be following and amplifying Loa Beebe. I wouldn't even be here without her. So these are people like, come on, guys. If you're listening, share the info. I also wanted to talk about the Two Spirit powwow that happened in Edmonton. Y'all don't understand. This was not happening that long ago. I had to pass a policy in the Liberal Party of Canada to even include the two in all of our 2S LGBTQ literature in order for us to start acknowledging it there, which mattered because we were also pushing the national inquiry, which finally went through. Not everybody's happy about it. I totally get it, but we have 231 calls to justice nobody's working on. So, anyway, to me, this whole inquiry was queer centered, thanks to the fabulous work of the people who ended up doing that work. And, seeing Two Spirit powwows nationally, internationally, up in Edmonton, this is massive, massive, massive. So to see it up there and see the great work the Two Spirit organization's doing up there, hats off to you. Thank you for creating a safer space for my little queerling and all the other little queerlings that are out there that are Indigenous, and trying to bring back our culture. And I'm trying really hard to start using they them, not because of trans, intersect, and gender affirming care, but that bigger picture that he and she was imposed by Christian colonists. So, you know, we all got to decolonize our language, myself included. And I'm just grateful for the court injunction that happened against the Alberta government so that trans, intersect, and those who need gender affirming care who are under 18 can still access that. It's just, I can't even with this government. Anyway, um, care without coercion. They have a whole website, and there's a petition there that doesn't support the Alberta government's Orwellian named Compassionate Intervention Act. It really talks about harm reduction. And another thing you can share, so you can share the care without coercion. You can sign up on their emails, you can sign their petition, but you can also start listening to Crackdown Podcast. Their latest episode really featured a 4B harm reduction in Edmonton. And the 4B stands for Brandon. So Brandon and his mother were on there talking about his journey of trying to stay alive, trying to stay, what recovery looks like for them. And so I think it's really important because as Canadians, you need to remember you're not giving us the cultural supports we need in healthcare, and you're not giving us the mental health care that we need that's culturally relevant. So if this couple is having the problems they are, imagine how much worse it is for Indigenous people. So if you claim to care about reconciliation and Indigenous people and treaty partnership, like start listening to this stuff and understand why it is I'm talking about medical racism. I'm sharing the stuff I am about Narcan and more. Um, and speaking of medical racism, I deeply honor Lillian Ashley. The widower of Lillian Ashley, Corey Ashley, has been on my podcast many times trying to talk about the medical racism that ultimately took the life of Lillian Ashley in Hannah, Alberta at a right around Christmas time when they were trying to access healthcare for them. And now that she's gone, Corey Ashley has just put his life towards trying to find justice. So he has a GoFundMe. He did a small update on his GoFundMe, and he will always be welcome on my podcast anytime. But again, if you have never heard of Lillian Ashley, You're not following Indigenous content creators. You're not sharing the podcast with other people to learn from. And this should be a conversation we should all be having. And we are not because we're too busy talking about trans rights. And while that matters, what we're not talking about is all the mismanagement of funds, billions of dollars at this point that the Alberta government is doing. So please, please, I implore you to start sharing this information. Um, Ooh, I'm going to go on a little bit of a national conversation now, an Indigenous national conversation. On June 27th, I seen Chrystia Freeland tweet out about meeting Adam Waterness, Kelly Gibson, and talking about a rail project from Banff to Calgary. So let's break that down a little more. And for any other journalists that follow me and steal my content, let this be a conversation, please. Uh, who is Adam Waterous? He is the CEO of Waterous Energy Fund. They also have ties to the oil sands. So this is a multi-billion-dollar trust fund conversation that Mr. Adam Waterous is having with Chrystia Freeland. Kelly Gibson is the town of Banff representative. And they're having a conversation about a passenger rail project. And I see zero representation from Treaty 7, from the Stoney Nations, or Blackfoot either. And I think it's really important to start talking about the War Measures Act in Banff. So, once upon a time in a galaxy far, far away, before I had children, I used to teach scuba diving. My husband taught it. I was his dive master. We'd go out to Lake Minnewanka regularly and teach, affluent Calgarians, and they would get their open water certificates so that they could go scuba dive in whatever, Mexico, wherever their vacation is. And so we would dive in Lake Minnewanka. And the last year we did it before we retired from to have babies, we had to be park wardens and such. But all the scuba divers from Calgary that dive Minnewanka all the time, we know more about Bankhead and the Wars Measures Act than I'm sure most of these, like, imported Australian summer wardens that we get. So let's talk about that. So the town of Bankhead was a mining town before Banff National Park, and they were trying to mine the area of coal, and they realized that that this area was going to become a national park. And so the First World War, they imposed the War Measures Act, and they made their first major dam in Lake Minnewanka. And from that, uh, I should also say this to acknowledge the Chinese. Um, so the miners wouldn't allow the British miners wouldn't allow any of the Chinese to be with them. So there was like a little Chinatown away from Bankhead, right? Like they were separated on purpose, and that you see that nationally all across the country, where Chinatown is always a separate place where none of the settlers would go. And obviously, it's evolved a little bit, but not by much, let me tell you. And one day I'll talk about Chinatown here, but I'll probably bring in a guest for that because it's not really for me to talk about. But anyway, First World War, mainly Ukrainian slaves that were imprisoned in the camps that were by Banff. And they were the ones who were forced to basically make Banff. Like, it's so beautiful. Everybody's like, oh my God, it's so pretty. Look how pretty it is at the G7. Thanks to the Ukrainian slaves for the First World War. Second World War, we had the Japanese intern camps, same thing. They were the ones that basically continued the work and made a second dam that we have today. So there's this massive causeway if you're at Lake Minnewanka, and that was the Second World War dam that they created. Um, so lots of water at Lake Minnewanka, thanks to the War Measures Act that were imposed the First and Second World War, and done by slave labor of imprisoned, what do you call it when it's concentration camp, but um, I don't know, imprisoned people that we deemed was the enemy at the time. So Ukrainians the first time, Japanese the second time, and Nazi sympathizers to a point. Anyway, I'm getting way off. Anyway. that both times that those dams were done, that wasn't done with any Indigenous consultation either. And so now we're basically at war again. And we're going to, I'm just waiting for the Emergencies Act to be implemented again so that we can just outright say we're in World War III. And I'm sure that's when they'll impose this passenger rail project, even though it should be existing. Like, I don't understand why it is they're not working with Indigenous people at that. So something to watch, something I'm watching anyway, and as I can with limited resources. I'm not exactly a journalist, so important to pay attention to that. And now I want to talk about Terry Fox. Canadian pastime. We all love Terry Fox. And his anniversary for June 28th came up in 1981. He died. And so I was seeing lots of tributes out there, like, oh, the great Terry Fox, as he should. I mean, everyone in Canada, like, you don't understand. If you're an American or if you're international and you don't know, like, we live, eat, and breathe Terry Fox as Canadians. Um, we have Terry Fox runs every September, and we raise funds for cancer research because that was his work. And the one thing I was not seeing people recognize was that he was Métis. And so I just did a little TikTok because I do TikToks every day about whatever Indigenous issue I felt like talking about that day. And that was the one I talked about, was that he was Métis, and that you know, the government policies against Indigenous people have caused colonial trauma, medical racism, health issues. And his Métis relatives at Red River, they had to flee to the States. So by Canada's own, policies, they didn't want a Terry Fox. They wanted all Métis dead. They wanted all Indigenous people dead. Like, they would have never respected him in any capacity if he came out as Métis first. So that's why it's important for people to talk about the fact that Canada's education system is not teaching oppression dynamics. They're not talking about the health issues, the medical racism, and colonial trauma. Um, but that would be absolutely a contributor to Terry Fox's health issues. But we never talk like that, right? Like, that's why the COVID-19 conversation, like, we don't talk about the real issues here, right? I do, but nobody else does. These are contributing factors to the very cancer he was fighting. But because so on TikTok, I get these algorithms, and they tell me how long people will watch a video. What I learned was 4-minute videos, nobody's listening to. 3-minute ones, no one's listening to. So if I can't say something in 60 seconds or less, like, it's not even fucking worth putting on TikTok, because people don't have any type of like interest to really listen to something. That's why you, my podcast listeners, thank you, because you clearly can listen from start to end and you're not turning it off like within the first 30 seconds. But it turns out when I say Terry Fox was Métis, most people did. About 90,000 people did. And most of the comments that I got were really, like, it really caused pause for me. I learned a lot. I learned how whitewashed our Indigenous history is. I learned how it's not showing oppression dynamics. It's not talking about like any kind of accountability for that oppression in any way. They're just like, oh my God, we have natives and we like them. They're not talking about the real history at all. So, but they're also not pointing out that Terry Fox was Métis. Ironically, I did have one person say that their Christian school that they went to, when they found out he was Métis, they quit doing the Terry Fox run, which I thought was a whole level of racism. Holy cow. But for the most part, it was just mainly comments from folks just finding out for the first time that Métis, you know, and the Red River Rebellion have a history with Terry Fox's family. And so that's not being taught in school. It's not being taught as a part of the Calgary, Terry Fox Foundation runs that we do every September. And the health points I was making was completely lost because everyone was just shocked he was Métis, which I found really shocking because, like, So I have a good friend of mine who I ran with. He ran for mayor of Chilliwack, and he was Two Spirit. He's a Métis fellow out in BC, and he worked with the Fox family to create the Métis sash. And this was a conversation they had in 2011. It's on the Terry Fox Foundation website. So I was really shocked that Canadians were still oblivious to this, that they were Native. And so, like, again, you've heard me talk about the oppression dynamics of how, people knew I wasn't Cree, I wasn't Blackfoot, but they didn't know what I was, and they weren't like okay with that. But they couldn't outright say, "Shut up, squaw," even though some people did. Some people figured it out. Anyway, a lot of Métis hid. They hid who they were. And again, I couldn't graduate with beads. I couldn't graduate proudly being Native. My daughter could, thank God, and we're trying to encourage that. But there are lots of boomers, a lot of folks from this military industrial complex that will come in and go, "You're lying. This isn't even on Google." And it's like, yes, it is. If you type Terry Fox Métis, yes, it is. And I'm not saying anything new. I'm not speaking on behalf of the family. I'm literally amplifying the family. And there, I even had a native come in and was like, "You shouldn't be talking about this." And I'm like, holy fucking Jesus. If you had your way, we'd all still be in a rock. Like, Jesus Christ. So, bigger picture, folks, learn about oppression dynamics of racism. There is a reason why your education system is not teaching you that Terry Fox is Métis, and it's because of racism. And for, the new kids who are seeing some Indigenous inclusion, they were totally pissed that the education system is not teaching them Terry Fox is native or Métis. So, for the new kids, for my new TikTok followers, for my new podcast listeners, white coding is a part of Canadian identity. That is so normalized. I'm sad that people don't see racism. We have racism in the queer community. I have podcasts about that too. Like, I can go on and on. Today we know. Today we know about the, clearing the plains policies that have been, there's books on this. We've done that book. We've done The Importance of Monogamy by Sarah Carter. Basically, anybody who reads Sarah Carter books, you need to read all of them. Lots of things I talk about to showcase. And I talked about Terry Fox being Métis because I showcase Indigenous pride, and Terry Fox is arguably the Canadian icon, and rightfully so, should be respected as a Métis Canadian icon. So that's why I brought it up. And if this is the first time you're listening, that's okay. I'm try to do it every year. So if you're a regular listener, maybe this is your third time you've heard it, but as we all know, a teacher has to teach something 7 times for anybody to get it. So here we are. The One Canadian Economy Act is is in full force. I wrote an article last year, and I wrote an article this year in the Hill Times. Nobody shared them, even though I shared it. Anyway, in this latest one, I talked about infrastructure. Many of you know, who have listened to me before, I talk about the National Indigenous Economic Strategy. It talks about the underfunding of infrastructure over the course of Canada since the Indian Act, and the deficit infrastructure we have. So this particular, there's 107 calls to prosperity, and they talk about that underfunding, full investment, and then continued investment, right? So that's what I wrote about in the Hill Times. And I was honored to do that. I hope they ask me to do it again. But I know it's based off of clicks and shares. And I know my own following did not share and click on this article, so I don't think it got out. So, I was lucky enough to get asked twice. Hopefully they'll let me do it again. And I want to give one more shout out to informedopinion.org. Please follow them. They are an organization that work really hard of finding women talking about issues that are qualified to talk about issues. I was identified back when I ran, And as a result, I've been lucky enough to have them put me out there, usually in June, to talk about whatever it is we're talking about. And because the topic was more based off of this conversation of national infrastructure, that's why I chose to focus on that. So my hope is that if you get nothing out of this, you can either amplify the Hill Times article, or you can amplify the National Indigenous Economic Strategy. Because if we're talking about nation building, or if we're talking about national nation building, this is literally the road to reconciliation, is that we're going to have to do investment into Indigenous people. And Canada wins from this. Like, your GDP will go up as a result. So read the document, because I think you'd be surprised. Like, it doesn't just benefit Indigenous people, it benefits all of Canada. But that said, I shared a National Post article that talked about stolen land and a survey being done. And what was so funny about it was that, they found that most people across Canada, so 52%, do not live on stolen land. So that shows you where we actually are with reconciliation, where you have the majority of Canadians that still don't understand anything, which is why, of course, when I talk about Terry Fox and the education system failing you on oppression dynamics, that's why you get this result of 52% not believing that they live on stolen Indigenous land. Sure as hell don't see themselves as treaty partners that are supposed to treat people equally either. So, really problematic. But of course, while most urban centers did believe that they had the higher percentage of it, like not in urban Canada at all, not in Calgary. In Calgary, we had the highest amount of people rejecting that their land is stolen. Like 69% outright said no, as opposed to 52% nationally. But it's funny because, like, even my friend on the Reconciliation Action Group was like always quick to say 69, but 11% didn't answer. That's 80% of people not saying, hey, we live on stolen land. So that's why when I say share what you learned from this podcast, that's why it matters, because 80% of Calgarians are like, "What stolen land? Ugh, human rights? What human rights?" Oh, God. So the flotilla to Gaza was happening at the same time the G7 was happening in Calgary. And we watched what happened with Greta Thunberg and the folks that were on that flotilla trying to get supplies to the Gazans. Um, I, in fact, I was told, I seen a TikTok, don't refer to them as Gazans, refer to them as Palestinians, because that's what they are, that just happen to live on the Gaza Strip. And, you know, uh, because the G7 was happening here, we had at City Hall this one day, we had like the water protectors, which is why I went. So we had like keepers of the water, and we had the Bagani Nation talking about the coal mining that Alberta's trying to do, and the issues up north with the dirty water. Water is life. This is our substance. And it was really important for us to be there. While that was happening, the Palestinians were there, folks for the Congo. There were folks for like all across the globe were there, trying to talk about their issues specifically. And so we had our speeches, and I was working a little bit with this group called the International Students of Anti-Imperialism. Really great group of people, but they have no chapter here in Calgary, so they were really just trying to build that. And they had Yves Engler. He came, did a speech, and there was supposed to be some group that came and didn't, so I got to share the stage with him. I don't know if any of that was recorded. I did share what I could on Instagram and on my Facebook story, but that's where the kids are. They're all on the Instagram. So, my folks who listen to the TikTok wouldn't necessarily see that. And then, folks who aren't on Facebook, they wouldn't see that either. So, yeah, it's hard because depending on what generation you are, depends on what social media you're on too. So I appreciate my podcast listeners. I've seen the demographics, and I appreciate all of you for being here. Um, so anyway, we had our rally immediately after the water protectors rally. We marched, and that was done basically by the International Students Against Imperialism. And we were marching, and we kind of we're supposed to go one way, but the Calgary police totally cut us off and corralled us, so we had to go back. And so we did because, we're no John Poncourt splitting the sky level of let's fight the police. Not these folks. And in fact, I would argue the Calgarian Palestinians unfortunately have been doing that since October 7th of almost 2 years ago now, and it's not right. They experienced the violence of Calgary police firsthand at the University of Calgary, and mad respect for them for that. But ultimately, the Calgary police, the RCMP, the Canadian military, they're all embedded with Israel. And so at the end of the day, citizens are not of Canada. You know, they don't understand Muslims, Palestinians, they are Indigenous. And as a result, the police are going to kill them as much as they'll kill us, no problem. They literally hit this pregnant woman. She was forced to go into labor, and Calgary police don't care. Neither does the UFC. In fact, one of the folks got elected to be MP now. So that's where we're at. Anyway, I was trying to get back to my car, which was at the city hall, and the Calgary police, like, there was like, hundreds of us. There was only like four of us in ribbon skirts and scarves, and I was with a settler friend. So like the four of us were spread apart in the hundreds of people, and they wouldn't let me go to my car. They made me go for a long walk around instead, so I did. And when I got back to the parkade, my white friend they let through, so I had to open the door for him, and I was just like, just proof how underserved and over policed indigenous people are, and especially when we're visibly in our regalia, which I was at the time. And of course the texts from the Calgary police and the RCMP were just victim blaming, like, oh well, I'm here if you ever need me. And it's like, no, you're not. I've tried this before. You guys aren't there for Indigenous people. You're just data mining us. And I was just lucky you didn't throw us in jail. I even said that. I said, we're in a group of Palestinians and one native, me. And I said, look, you're just data mining our cars, getting our license plates. You're probably going to arrest most of us on the Thursday before the G7 and let us go the day after. And this one RCMP says to me, well, but if I don't arrest you, will you trust me? No! Fucking no! So anyway, that was a G7. I'll never trust them. I can't. I've tried to work with them. Many families have. They purposely do not do the work, so there's nothing you can do. But you know who I do have mad respect for? Minor Chiefs Stephen Crowchild for capturing the world's attention for when he talked to Trump. We had this folks on, it was the social media that drove me nuts about this at first, because at first they didn't know who he was. So it was just some random native chief. They didn't even know who he was, and that hurt my heart because I know him. Just, I always encourage people in my circle that know what treaty you're in, follow all of those nations, and know the people who are leaders. Like, if you know the mayor of Airdrie, then you should know the chief of Sutina, right? And you should be on all their social medias. Just like if you're on Airdrie's social media, you should be on Sutina's social media. So of course I know who Stephen Crowchild is, and I knew him before he was elected. So I just think he's a great guy. Anyway, he was the lucky guy who got to talk to people, but all the social media internationally were like, oh my God, dear disabled community, do a bunch of free labor for us and tell us what he said. And I'm like, you bunch of. So, first of all, let's name him as Stephen Crowchild. But also, this is what he said, because I'm friends with him on, whatever social media. So I took a screenshot, sourced it, gave it out there. To which the international media and all the social influencers that are white took that information and start putting out, what he said and who he was. And thank God, because being nameless Indian people piss me off. Like, You're bad media, you're bad social media people. You're clearly not reading the 231 calls to justice as media influencers. Don't get me started. It's there. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go Google it. I've already written about it extensively numerous times. Anyway, so hats off to Stephen Crowchild for talking to Trump and being willing to go through that because like he really spoke for all of us and he kind of knew it, but he was really resentful at the time. Don't blame him. And hopefully one day, if he's ever comfortable coming on the podcast to talk about it, he will. But honestly, I think the national chief, Cindy Woodhouse Nippanack, who you all better be following, she also shared his information so that it got out there about who he was and what he said, because everybody was asking, like, who is this guy and what did he say? So, Trump, as usual, a total doofus. Um, he even outright said that, well, Trudeau kicked Russia out of the G8, and that's not helping anyone. And it's like, that is the most easily refutable information in the world. Stephen Harper kicked out Russia in 2014 over Russia's invasion of Crimea. Like, Trump is such a doofus. I don't know how anyone can say a positive thing about that man. Regardless, I put out another TikTok because I know Trump hated Justin Trudeau because Justin Trudeau was liberal and good looking, and his wife looked at Justin Trudeau and in those eyes that say, I really like you, um in a spicy way. So so Trump hates Trudeau, right? He's such a pathetic, insecure, entitled con man. How Americans elected him, I'll never understand. But regardless, he really hated how the popularity, not just nationally here in Canada, but internationally for Trudeau. And you've seen that immediately transferred to Mark Carney. And so much so, like, there was a rallying moment where this lady yelled out, lead us, Big Daddy. And on TikTok, there's like thirst traps for Mark Carney. So, in the most pathetic thing I have ever seen in cringy social media history, the White House put out this post after the G7, moving on to the NATO summit, about, Trump being a daddy and how, when he went to this NATO summit, daddy's home. And I mean, I can't stand this concept at all because I think it just like perpetuates patriarchy. But it was so disgusting and gross for the leader of the world to be putting out social media posts like this. Like there it's become such a pathetic joke. I just can't imagine in 50 years how history will look at this moment in time. But anyway, it was just really petty and gross that he was trying to claim the daddy name through the social media. If you follow the liberal.ca social media on any of the platforms, we never put out stuff like that ever. We only put out our basic talking points about economy or trading partnership, or Canadian pride, whatever it is. But we would never put out anything like that because that's not how you govern. Um, anyway, I can't even with the US. I wanted to bring up, though, back to Canada, it's really important to us acknowledge this. Canadians, if Trump has the new Nazi black shirts called ICE, which is what you're seeing, and you're not speaking out against that, like, you have to understand they're coming after us. You have to understand that. Now, for those of you who weren't following Stephen Harper because you're not old as the hills as I am, Stephen Harper really got embedded into the military industrial complex, and a lot of his funds, trust funds, all is for Israel, very much Israeli. Way back in like 20, I don't know, 11, our liberal EDA did the book, Marcy McDonald's The Road to Armageddon, and it really outlines Canadians' role in all of this. I also want to point out Yves Engler at that time put out a book about Stephen Harper that I bought and had him sign at that time. He's been putting out good content to explain the gravity of how embedded in war we actually are, and how Canadians don't see that. I will never understand how they have not done more to stop all of this. I have no idea. But there are lots of us who are anti-imperialists, who are anti-colonial violence. Folks, I've done many books clubs on police violence, and at that time I was talking about military violence, etc. Now we're investing into our military, and I just wanted to give a shout out to Canadian journalist David Mastorati. So it's spelled David with an E. Have no idea. I hate English, let alone other languages. So I apologize if I got his name wrong. He is a Canadian journalist. He published a database of Canadians who have served under Israel, and the RCMP investigated him. They came to the conclusion it was non-criminal, but journalists should not be investigated for publishing truth. And the fact that Canadians are so complacent in allowing things like that to happen without their public outcry shows how, most Canadians are like, I'm left. No, you're not. You're almost always right of center. And this kind of stuff proves it. The way you're okay with our health issues being treated the way they are, though, like I could go on. So, you know, for people who actually care about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, I know that's a long time ago when people actually cared about civil liberties. His civil liberties are being, investigated by the state. Canadian journalists should have been speaking out about the journalists being murdered in Palestine. They're not. So they should be speaking out against this police database against our journalists, but they're not. But I am. It's wrong. It's gross. And it should be on the radar for all Canadians, let alone Indigenous Canadians. Now, I knew back in Stephen Harper's days, if you were on the Indian Act list, you were automatically given to CSIS in the Canadian military. And before I got my daughter her status, I talked about that. I said, look, you got to know consent matters. If you go to a hospital, you're going to be red flagged as Native, so you're going to be underserved and over policed. Same with just being registered. And so, this is why I speak out for him. I wish more people would. I should reach out to him and ask if he'd be on here at all. Anyway, thank you for listening. Last thing I want to talk about is the book club. Tanya Talaga's Unknowing or Knowing. The Knowing, that's what it is. That's our next book club. I'm going to give a shout out to Arc of the Medicine Line by Tony Rees, even though he is a settler. He has the best documentation of why the US-Canadian border exists the way it does, as it was surveyed. And to me, that's really important. And it was a Blackfoot elder who told me to read the book and to have the book. And as like someone and I tell people this when I do land acknowledgement training teachings, is that, you're not taught. SATE is not teaching about treaty, isn't teaching about that. So like this Arc of the Medicine Line, like this should be a part of our Canadian understanding, and it's not. Obviously, I've spoken highly of the Reconciliation Action Group today. Join the group if you're in Calgary. And if you're not in Calgary, replicate something like that in your area. That's real reconciliation. Anyway, Masi Cho to my ancestors, to my granny, to my mom. You showed me what strength is through your example. To my dad for teaching me to be strong and blunt, probably a little tism there. My stepmom for showing me a proud culture. She is from Austria, and her and her family immigrated to Calgary, and she has taught me so much about, a proud culture and to be a proud Calgarian. And to my husband, I can't thank you enough for encouraging me to do this podcast, for producing and editing the show. You're my husband, you're my childhood friend, the father of our child. You're my journey of life. And you've witnessed the decades of ableism, racism, sexism, fat shaming, all of the things, all of the oppressions. And to our child, congratulations for graduating high school. We are blessed to learn from you daily. We are honored you chose us. You give me daily accountability to be a better person, and I hope my family will be proud of us trying to discuss these present day issues. And to the Blackfoot, Your elders and members have been kind to me on my journey. Elder Red Crane taught me how to pronounce my spirit name in Blackfoot. Leonard Kenny taught me how to pronounce it in Satu Dene. My humblest apologies to language keepers as I try to learn. My patron account is Native Calgarian, where you can pledge and support. Thank you, previous donors, for showing your support. If you value listening or watching and can afford to give, thank you. For those who cannot afford to give, I'd love to hear from you at nativeyyc@gmail.com, or you can send me an e-transfer. You can send me comments or questions. I have a YouTube channel that you can go and subscribe. You can go to nativecalgarian.com for the latest podcasts and pin posts on social media. And the last thing I like to do is a nice moment. And I wanted to tell you all that, as it turns out, valedictorian is not a word I see very often. And so I was mispronouncing it for 48 years and calling it valid Victorian when it isn't. So when I got my daughter's like agenda and I seen it, and I was like, what? I've been mispronouncing this entire time. So that's been a good laugh that I've had at myself for the last little while. I hope I'll be able to tell if you listen to this podcast, if you know that now about me. And my last thing I always say to all the Calgary rabbits, you're lucky I'm not tradish. My beautiful cousin would respond, or yeah, be in my dish. Thanks, folks, for listening.